as was the crime of killing a chicken. 14 For stealing oatmeal, one man had a needle driven through his tongue, and was then chained to a tree and left to die of starvation. 15 But the white colonists' inhuman treatment of each other for the pettiest of crimes did not extend to the elite members of the colony. The Virginia Company Charter included the island of Bermuda, which allowed Virginia's founders, like Lord Robert Rich, to make a fortune in piracy as they sailed from safe harbor in Virginia to safe harbor in Bermuda. Slave labor would simply replace one cruel system, servitude, with another. Men earned transatlantic passage by agreeing to work for the planter families, often for an indefinite period of time. The 220 from the sacred to the profane planters took advantage of the system and extended the length of service. London's poor and troublesome were disposed of by workhouses, prisons, the gallows, the military, and this new option, Virginia. Black slave labor came to replace the indefinite servitude of the whites. A head of cattle worth £5 in Virginia was worth £25 in Barbados, and that island would be a great source of slaves for the Virginia plantations. Unlike the sugar industry, in which the way to profits was working one slaves to death, the tobacco business featured easier work, and slave families were imported to maintain the plantations for a longer term. Despite the nature of tobacco planting, which was easier than that of the sugar industry, life was still dangerous for people who had no legal recourse. In 1669 the Virginia Assembly passed a law allowing murder of a slave as discipline for bad behavior. When Robert Carter applied to the court, in order to be allowed to dismember 2 disobedient slaves, his application was granted. 16 Virginia's first families, like the Ludwells, the Birds, the Carters, and the Spencers, shared the spoils of office and a series of well-placed marriages to become a new aristocracy. They built huge mansions on their landed estates. The Harrisons built Berkeley, the Lees built Stratford, the Carters built Sabine Hall, Namini Hall, and Carter's Grove, the Birds built Westover, the Randolphs built Tuckahoe, and the Washingtons built Mount Vernon. Masonry united the Virginia aristocrats, and important members of high society were lodge members as well. Although lodge records often did not survive the centuries, the membership of George Washington, George White, and George Mason is without doubt. There is evidence that future Presidents Monroe and Madison were also Masons, and the Masons do not claim only one of Virginia's aristocracy, Benjamin Harrison, as a lodge brother. James Madison, a scion of the planter aristocracy, played an active role in the Constitutional Convention. Like fellow planter George Washington, Madison had doubts about the concept of slavery and worked towards sending the black slaves back to Africa. Master Masons and their slaves. 221 Benjamin Harrison, the ancestor of Presidents William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison, and a co-signer of the Declaration of Independence, was the descendant of still another Benjamin Harrison, who was most likely a Bermuda planter. 17 The Tucker clan started with William Tucker, a sea captain who arrived in Virginia before 1620. He was entrusted with trading on behalf of the colony. In doing so, he concluded a treaty with the Pamunkey Indians by killing 200 of their tribe with poisoned wine. 18 The Tuckers also had one foot in Bermuda, with plantations there, and in Virginia dating to the early days of the Virginia Company. The deep South North Carolina had a plantation-driven economy, although only one Constitutional Convention member from that state, William Blount, was a plantation owner. Like several other signers, he was a lawyer and a Freemason. Blount was also a Revolutionary War hero who earned the respect of many in battle. Blount started anew after the Revolution as a land speculator. His threatened finances, however, induced him to take a subversive role designed to lead the country back into war. He wanted to see the new country defeat the Spanish and open the West. For this reason Blount became part of a conspiracy that attempted to turn over Florida to the British. He was booted from the Senate as a result. Blount had many friends, including fellow Mason Andrew Jackson, whom he had named Attorney General of the Tennessee Territory. These friends in high places and important lodges prevented Blount's impeachment from hindering his family's political dynasty, which would prosper into the next century. In South Carolina the elite caste, which built its fortunes in the slave trade and plantation industry, was all-powerful, and ran the colony in much the same way as the Caribbean states were run. The first governor of South Carolina was Sir John Yeamans, a Barbados planter who founded Charleston, and introduced slaves to clear his own plantation. 222 From the sacred to the profane. 100 years later the planter aristocracy was in full control of the state, even though the country was at the doorstep of democracy. Henry Laurens, who was at the Philadelphia Convention, was a partner in the firm of Austin and Laurens. The company was the largest of 12 firms in Charleston, capturing 25% of the slave trade. 19 Laurens held some of the largest plantations in the colony, and was one of the biggest merchants, handling rice, indigo, rum, beer, and wine. Slave traders usually earned a commission of 10% of the sale price of their trades, and the slave trade was big enough that the greatest mansions of Charleston were owned by the merchants and slave traders. Henry's father, John Laurens, was a Huguenot from La Rochelle in France. He was part of the Huguenot wave of immigration that fled Catholic France because of religious war and persecution. John would send his son Henry to England in 1744 to be trained as a merchant. Henry's education was furthered in South Carolina by making the right friends. He became a member of the Solomon's Lodge, and was trained in the craft by another wealthy Charleston merchant, James Crockett. 20 Membership in the lodge was very important in being accepted by other merchants and businessmen. Stephen Geary of Philadelphia had also joined Masonry through this influential lodge. Henry Laurens started the family trade, importing rum and other tropical goods from the West Indies, bringing manufactured goods from England, exporting rice and indigo, and buying slaves from British traders, and then selling them to South Carolina planters. He was soon sending his own ships to Africa to eliminate the British middlemen. The profits from his trade were invested in land, and by the Revolution he owned 8 plantations. He also entered politics, first at the local level and later in increasingly important positions. In 1770, with his fortune made, Henry brought his son to England to arrange for his son's education. There Henry became involved with the American contingent protesting grievances to Parliament. Once he returned to South Carolina, he withdrew from the merchant life and from the slave trade. This did not stop him from keeping his own slaves, however, who numbered 300. Master Masons and their slaves 223, while on a mission to Europe, to arrange a loan from the Netherlands. Henry Laurens was captured by the British, and spent 15 months in the Tower of London. He returned to South Carolina, to find his business ravaged by the Revolution, so he resigned from public life. When asked to join the Constitutional Convention as a representative of South Carolina, he declined, instead sending his new son-in-law. After the Battle of Yorktown, when England's willingness to support the protracted war was over, Laurens' English connection, Richard Oswald, was sent to negotiate the peace. Oswald, a Scottish slave trader who had appointed Laurens as his American agent, was sent by Lord Shelburne to Paris to meet with Benjamin Franklin. As the merchant caste was an elite minority, it was in its best interest to keep the group exclusive. From New England to the Carolinas intermarriage was the norm of the times. Charles Pinckney was the son of Colonel Charles Pinckney, a wealthy plantation owner, a lawyer, and a prominent Mason. Young Charles followed in his father's footsteps, but did himself one better. He married Mary Eleanor Laurens. Shortly after Pinckney's marriage, his career and his wealth soared. He became the governor of South Carolina, and along with his cousin Charles Coatesworth Pinckney he represented the state at the Constitutional Convention. Cousin Charles was also the son of a plantation owner, and was trained as a merchant and a lawyer. He too was in Washington's elite society of Cincinnati,